In the autumn of 1843, a Cumberland County estate auction drew bidders from as far as Charleston and New Orleans, but it was not the mahogany furniture or the 24,100 acres of river-bottom land that brought them. It was Lot 17, a woman, 23 years old, 287 pounds, the only child of Wallace Hendren, a tobacco planter whose sudden death 3 months prior had left his entire estate to be liquidated by creditors who refused to explain why they would not approach the barn behind his house. The barn where his daughter had been taken each week for 4 years. The barn where 7 enslaved men had been forced to participate in a system of reward so depraved that investigators would document it only in Latin, as if language itself could quarantine the truth. Before we continue with the story of the Hendren estate and what was discovered in that barn, I need you to do something. If stories like this, buried chapters of American depravity that our textbooks refuse to acknowledge, speak to the darkness you sense beneath our nation's mythology, hit that subscribe button right now. And here is something I want to know. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your state or city in the comments below. I am curious how far these American secrets reach. The Hendren fortune and the weight of inheritance. Wallace Hendren did not inherit his wealth. He extracted it from soil and flesh with the methodical patience of a man who understood that fortunes in Cumberland County were not made through innovation, but through the ruthless efficiency of repetition. By 1840, his 2,400 acres produced tobacco that fetched premium prices in Richmond and Philadelphia, and his name appeared on banknotes throughout the Tennessee Valley. But there was a peculiarity to the Hendren estate that his neighbors noticed but rarely discussed. He kept only 7 enslaved men, no women, no children, and his daughter Constance had not been seen in public since her 14th birthday. The Hendren property occupied a bend in the Cumberland River where the soil ran dark and deep, the kind of land that required no persuasion to yield profit. Wallace had purchased it in 1828 for $4,800, a sum he earned working as an overseer on 3 different plantations in Kentucky, saving every dollar with the single-minded focus of a man who understood that ownership was the only position worth holding. He built his house that same year, a 2-story structure of whitewashed brick with columns that announced prosperity without ostentation, and he planted his first tobacco crop in the spring of 1829. By 1832, he was shipping 12 hogsheads annually to Richmond. By 1836, that number had doubled. Other planters in the county operated on a larger scale. The Morrison estate employed 43 enslaved workers. The Caldwell Plantation maintained 37. But Wallace Hendren managed his 2,400 acres with just 7 men, a ratio that defied every principle of agricultural economics and prompted questions he never answered with specificity. When pressed at planters' assemblies, he would speak vaguely of efficiency and proper motivation, of understanding what truly compelled men to labor beyond the capacity they believed they possessed. He spoke of incentive structures that went beyond the conventional models, and he spoke with a confidence that suggested he had discovered something his peers had overlooked. The 7 men lived in a converted carriage house that Wallace had modified in 1837, adding iron rings to the floor and bars to the windows, alterations that seemed excessive for workers who had nowhere to run and no reason to believe escape was possible. They were never permitted to leave the property, not even for Sunday worship, a restriction so absolute that the minister of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church complained to Wallace personally about the absence of souls under his care. Wallace responded with a donation of $200 to the church building fund and a promise that his men received adequate spiritual instruction on the estate itself. The minister never raised the issue again. By 1843, Wallace Hendren had accumulated wealth estimated at $47,000, a fortune built on tobacco and something else, something that existed in the space between the ledger entries and the locked doors, between the public record of a successful planter and the private reality of what occurred on his property when darkness settled over the river and the rest of Cumberland County turned to sleep. Constance Hendren. The Daughter Behind the Curtains. The last documented public appearance of Constance Hendren occurred on April 12, 1834, at the dedication of the Cumberland County Courthouse. She was 14 years old, already showing signs of the unusual physical development that would define the rest of her brief life. And according to the diary of Margaret Whitfield, wife of the county clerk, she moved with a kind of labored determination that suggested each step required conscious effort. After that day, Constance vanished from social circulation entirely. No church attendance, no family visiting, no seasonal gatherings. The curtains in the east wing of the Hendren house remained drawn year-round, and when questioned, Wallace Hendren would respond with a statement that became identical through repetition. "My daughter is delicate in constitution and prefers the comfort of home." Margaret Whitfield's diary contains 7 separate references to Constance Hendren between 1830 and 1834, each entry documenting the girl's appearance at various social functions, with observations that begin as casual notation and gradually shift toward something closer to concern. In September 1830, Margaret describes Constance as a sturdy child with her father's dark eyes and a tendency toward shyness that is not unbecoming in a girl of 10 years. By December 1832, the description is changed. Constance Hendren has grown considerably and moves with less grace than previously noted. Her father watches her with an expression I cannot interpret. The final entry, dated April 1834, reads, "Constance appeared at the courthouse dedication, wearing a dress that seemed constructed to conceal rather than flatter. She spoke to no one and departed before the ceremony concluded. I do not expect we shall see her again in public company." Margaret Whitfield's prediction proved accurate. For the next 9 years, Constance Hendren existed only as an absence, a name occasionally mentioned in conversation, but never accompanied by actual presence. Women who called at the Hendren house were received by Wallace himself, or by Dinah Marsh, the housekeeper, and were told that Constance was resting, or reading, or indisposed by one of the vague feminine ailments that polite society did not inquire about too directly. The east wing where she lived remained inaccessible to visitors, and the external staircase that led to her rooms saw traffic only from Dinah Marsh, who brought meals 3 times daily and removed the trays an hour later, and from Wallace Hendren himself, who climbed those stairs each evening after supper and did not descend until morning. In 1838, Wallace commissioned a seamstress from Nashville to create a series of dresses for his daughter, providing measurements that caused the seamstress, a woman named Eliza Turnbull, to question whether she had recorded the numbers correctly. According to her account book, which survives in the Tennessee State Archives, the measurements indicated a woman of exceptional size, and the 6 dresses she completed required nearly twice the fabric of a standard garment. She delivered them personally to the Hendren estate and was paid in cash. She never saw Constance Hendren. Wallace accepted the dresses at the front door, examined them briefly, and closed the door without inviting her inside. By 1843, Constance Hendren had become something between a rumor and a ghost, a presence felt but never confirmed, and the few people who claimed to have glimpsed her through the windows of the east wing reported seeing a figure of such substantial size that they questioned their own perception. The architecture of isolation. The Hendren house was built in 1829 according to a design that Wallace Hendren himself commissioned, and architectural historians who have examined the surviving floor plans note peculiarities that suggest the structure was intended to accommodate unusual domestic arrangements. The east wing, where Constance resided, featured doorways a full 8 inches wider than standard construction, floors reinforced with double joists, and a separate external staircase that led directly to the 2nd floor without passing through the main house. The barn, located 200 feet behind the main structure, was rebuilt in 1838, with interior modifications that included a ventilation system more elaborate than any agricultural building in the county, and a door that locked from the outside with an iron bolt mechanism typically used in jails. The main house followed conventional plantation architecture of the period. A central hallway with rooms branching to either side, high ceilings for air circulation, and windows positioned to capture the prevailing breeze from the river. But the east wing departed from symmetry in ways that suggested purpose beyond aesthetics. The door frames were constructed to accommodate passage that standard frames would have restricted. The floors, which in typical construction would have been supported by joists spaced 16 inches apart, were instead reinforced with joists at 8-inch intervals, creating a substructure capable of bearing weight that would have caused conventional flooring to sag or crack. And the external staircase, built of treated oak with treads twice the normal depth, rose to a private entrance that could be bolted from the outside, transforming the east wing into a space that was less a residence than a containment. The barn drew less attention during Wallace Hendren's lifetime because barns were utilitarian structures that neighbors had no reason to examine closely. But the 1838 reconstruction transformed it from a simple storage building into something more complex. The original structure, built when Wallace first purchased the property, measured 30 feet by 40 feet and served the conventional purposes of hay storage and equipment shelter. The rebuilt barn measured 40 feet by 60 feet and was divided into two distinct sections by an interior wall of heavy timber. The front section maintained the appearance of agricultural use, with stalls for horses and space for tools and supplies. The rear section, accessed through a door that remained padlocked except during hours that Wallace determined, contained modifications that suggested human occupancy rather than livestock housing. A ventilation system ran the length of the barn's roof peak, with grates positioned to allow air circulation without permitting visual access from outside. The interior walls of the rear section were lined with fabric, heavy canvas material that absorbed sound and created an atmosphere of muffled privacy. And in the center of the space stood a platform raised 18 inches above the floor and constructed with the same reinforced joisting that supported the floors of the east wing, capable of bearing weight that would have collapsed a standard structure. The platform measured 8 feet by 10 feet and was draped with fabric that could be changed as needed. Around its perimeter, iron rings were embedded in the floor at regular intervals, their purpose unstated, but their presence suggesting restraint or positioning that required anchoring. The architecture of the Hendren estate, when examined with knowledge of what would later be discovered, reveals itself as a system designed for isolation and control, each modification serving a purpose that Wallace Hendren understood but never articulated. Wallace Hendren's peculiar labor philosophy. In the spring of 1839, Wallace Hendren attended a planters' assembly in Nashville where the topic of labor efficiency dominated the evening's discussion. According to minutes preserved in the Tennessee Historical Society archives, Hendren contributed a statement that left several attendees profoundly unsettled. He proposed that the traditional models of slave management failed to exploit what he called the complete spectrum of human motivation, and that planters who relied solely on punishment and deprivation were ignoring the darker possibilities of reward. He spoke for 17 minutes, and when he finished, the moderator moved immediately to the next topic without allowing questions. 3 men who heard that speech would later testify that they suspected then what they would learn with certainty 4 years later. The Planters' Assembly of 1839 convened in the ballroom of the Maxwell House Hotel on April 14th, drawing 43 plantation owners from across Tennessee and northern Alabama. The stated purpose was discussion of soil conservation and crop rotation, but conversation inevitably turned to labor management, the question that consumed more attention than any agricultural technique. The prevailing wisdom, articulated by men who had inherited their wealth and their slaves from fathers who had done the same, held that efficient labor required strict discipline, adequate nutrition to maintain working capacity, and the ever-present threat of consequences for insufficient performance. It was a system built on fear and deprivation, and it had functioned without fundamental revision for generations. Wallace Hendren, listened to 2 hours of discussion before requesting permission to speak. When the moderator recognized him, Wallace stood and delivered a critique of conventional labor management that began with economic analysis and progressed towards something that made his audience increasingly uncomfortable. He argued that fear and punishment produced only the minimum effort necessary to avoid consequences, that workers operating under pure coercion would never exceed baseline expectations, and that planters who relied exclusively on negative motivation were leaving productivity gains unrealized. What was needed, he suggested, was a system that understood the full range of human desire, that recognized men would labor beyond their perceived capacity if offered rewards they could not otherwise obtain. He spoke about incentive structures that moved beyond additional rations or reduced working hours, rewards that addressed what he termed fundamental appetites that civilized society typically suppressed or regulated through law and custom. He suggested that the institution of slavery created opportunities for motivation that extended into territories conventional morality refused to acknowledge, and that planters who were willing to move beyond traditional constraints could achieve productivity levels that their more squeamish peers could never match. He did not provide explicit examples. He did not need to. The implications of his language were sufficiently clear that several men in the audience exchanged glances that communicated shared discomfort. When Wallace concluded his remarks, the ballroom remained silent for nearly 30 seconds before the moderator thanked him curtly and moved to the next agenda item without inviting response or discussion. During the evening social hour, Wallace found himself standing alone near the punch table while other attendees conversed in groups that pointedly excluded him. 3 men approached him separately over the course of the evening: Robert Caldwell, James Morrison, and Samuel Yates, all plantation owners from counties adjacent to Cumberland. Each asked essentially the same question in slightly different language: whether Wallace had implemented the theories he described, and if so, what results he had observed. Wallace smiled and suggested that any man interested in improved productivity should visit his estate and examine his methods personally. None of them accepted the invitation. The 7 men of the Hendren estate. The enslaved population at the Hendren estate remained constant at 7 men throughout the 1830s and into the early 1840s, a number that defied both agricultural logic and the demographic patterns of every neighboring plantation. They ranged in age from 19 to 34, all purchased at auctions in Louisville and Lexington between 1836 and 1840, and each selected, according to later testimony, for physical attributes that Wallace Hendren evaluated personally before bidding. They were housed, not in the traditional quarters, but in a converted carriage house that featured iron rings embedded in the floor, a detail that would not be discovered until the estate was inventoried after Hendren's death. And they were never permitted to leave the property boundaries, even for Sunday worship, a restriction so absolute that neighboring planters noted it as extraordinary, even by the standards of the institution. The first acquisition occurred in March 1836 at a Louisville auction where Wallace purchased a man identified in the bill of sale as Simon, age 26, described as healthy and experienced in field labor. The purchase price was $780, slightly above market average, and witnesses to the transaction later recalled that Wallace spent considerable time examining the man before bidding, evaluating not just his physical condition, but his height, build, and a quality that one witness described as vitality or masculine presence that seemed to interest Mr. Hendren specifically. Simon was transported to the Cumberland County estate in chains, a precaution Wallace insisted upon despite the auctioneer's assurance that the man had never attempted escape and showed no signs of rebellious temperament. Over the next 4 years, Wallace made 6 additional purchases, each at carefully selected auctions in Kentucky, never buying from Tennessee sellers who might later visit his estate or inquire about the welfare of men they had sold. The pattern of selection remained consistent: men in their 20s or early 30s, physically robust, and possessing what Wallace evaluated through observation and brief conversation during the auction preview period. He purchased Moses in July 1836 for $820, He acquired Samuel in November 1837 for $7.95. Benjamin came to the estate in March 1838, followed by Isaac in September of that year. Jacob was purchased in January 1839, and the final addition, a man named Daniel, arrived in April 1840. The total expenditure for the 7 men was $5,630, a substantial investment for a planter who maintained such a small enslaved population. They worked Wallace's tobacco fields from sunrise to mid-afternoon, performing labor that was demanding but not excessive by the standards of plantation agriculture. They maintained the property, repaired fences, managed the small livestock operation, and completed the seasonal tasks that tobacco cultivation required. But their labor productivity, measured by the acres each man cultivated, and the yield per acre, exceeded typical performance by margins that neighboring planters found remarkable and inexplicable. Wallace's tobacco output per enslaved worker averaged 47% higher than comparable estates, a figure that generated both admiration and suspicion among men who could not identify any agricultural technique that would account for such efficiency. The 7 men spoke rarely to each other and never to outsiders. They maintained expressions that observers described as blank or deliberately neutral, faces that revealed nothing of interior thought or feeling. And they never attempted escape, never engaged in the small acts of resistance that characterized slave behavior throughout the South, never required the application of discipline that other planters considered routine. They were, by all observable measures, the most compliant and productive enslaved workers in Cumberland County, and no one who had not entered the barn behind Wallace Hendren's house after dark could understand why. The ledgers and the reward system. Wallace Hendren kept 3 sets of account books. The first recorded tobacco production, sales, and expenses in conventional agricultural notation. The second tracked the health, behavior, and labor output of his 7 enslaved men with the detached precision of a livestock breeder. The third ledger, discovered in a locked drawer of his desk after his death, documented something else entirely. It contained dates, times, and coded entries that referenced what Hendren termed sessions and rotations, each entry accompanied by a numerical notation that corresponded to either increased rations, reduced labor hours, or the assignment of specific living privileges. The ledger covered a period of 4 years and contained 416 individual entries, an average of 2 per week, with gaps only during the winter months when Hendren traveled to Lexington on business. The first ledger was conventional in every respect, and would have been recognized by any planter in Tennessee as standard business documentation. It recorded the planting of 12 acres of tobacco on April 18, 1839. It noted the purchase of 3 barrels of salt pork on June 3 at a cost of $14.50. It documented the sale of 8 hogsheads of tobacco to a Richmond buyer on September 20 for $480. The entries were clear, organized chronologically, and maintained with the regularity of a man who understood that wealth required accurate accounting. This ledger sat openly on Wallace's desk, available for review by any visitor or business associate who might require verification of his financial position. The second ledger occupied a shelf in Wallace's study and contained records that reflected his management of human property with the same attention he applied to tobacco cultivation. Each of the 7 men had a dedicated section where Wallace recorded their health status, any disciplinary incidents, productivity measurements, and observations about their temperament or behavior. An entry from May 1840 reads, Simon, cleared 3/4 acre Thursday, pace maintained throughout afternoon, no signs of fatigue or reduced effort, evening disposition compliant. Another from August 1841 states, Moses, requested additional blanket granted. Work output remains consistent with expectations, cooperative during Wednesday session. The language was clinical and detached, treating human beings as agricultural assets whose performance required monitoring and occasional adjustment. The third ledger was different. It was smaller, bound in dark leather, and kept locked in the bottom drawer of Wallace's desk, beneath a false panel that was discovered only during the thorough inventory conducted after his death. The entries were coded, using initials rather than full names and abbreviations, whose meaning would not have been clear to anyone unfamiliar with the system Wallace had created. A typical entry read, S. Wednesday evening, 8 p.m. barn, session duration. 90 minutes, ration increase approved, Sunday labor exemption granted. Another stated, Friday evening, 9 p.m. barn, session duration 75 minutes, additional tobacco allowance authorized, quarters inspection waived. The ledger began on March 15, 1839, and continued through June 1843, ending 3 weeks before Wallace's death. The entries followed patterns that suggested careful scheduling, designed to prevent excessive repetition and to distribute access in a manner that created anticipated rewards. No man appeared more than once in any 7-day period. Sessions occurred primarily on Wednesday and Friday evenings, with occasional additions on Sunday afternoons, when agricultural demands were minimal. Duration varied between 60 and 120 minutes, and the rewards granted in exchange escalated gradually over the 4-year period, beginning with simple ration increases and progressing toward privileges that included private sleeping quarters, exemption from Sunday labor, and what Wallace termed extended evening autonomy, a phrase whose meaning would become horrifyingly clear when the full nature of the sessions was revealed. The onset of Constance's confinement. Constance Hendren's withdrawal from public life coincided precisely with the physical transformation that began during her 14th year, a development that her father documented in letters to a physician in Louisville with a frankness that suggests he viewed his daughter's condition as a medical curiosity rather than a source of paternal concern. By the age of 16, she weighed, according to the physician's records, 214 pounds, a figure that would increase to 287 pounds by the time of her father's death 7 years later. The letters reveal that Wallace Hendren requested specific dietary consultations, not to reduce his daughter's weight, but to sustain it, a detail that would later take on significance so disturbing that the physician, Dr. Samuel Cartwright, would burn his copies of the correspondence before his own death in 1849. The transformation began gradually in late 1833, when Constance was 13 years old. According to Margaret Whitfield's diary entries from that period, the girl had always been substantial in build, but not unusually so, and she moved with the ordinary energy of a child entering adolescence. But by the spring of 1834, something had changed. Constance's appetite had increased dramatically, and her body was responding to the increased consumption with a rapidity that alarmed Dinah Marsh, the housekeeper, who mentioned her concerns to Wallace and received instructions that she was to provide Constance with whatever food she requested in whatever quantities she desired. When Dinah suggested that perhaps some dietary restraint might be beneficial, Wallace told her that he would manage his daughter's health according to his own judgment, and that her role was to follow instructions, not to offer medical opinions. By October 1834, 6 months after Constance's final public appearance, Wallace initiated correspondence with Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a Louisville physician whose practice specialized in what were then termed disorders of constitutional balance. The letters, fragments of which survived in Cartwright's estate papers despite his attempt to destroy them, reveal a father discussing his daughter's physical development with the detachment of a natural scientist observing a specimen. Wallace provided detailed measurements, height, weight, circumference of waist and hips, and observations about her mobility and stamina. He asked specific questions about dietary composition that would promote continued weight gain while maintaining overall health, about the limits of human adipose tissue accumulation, and about the psychological effects of rapid physical transformation on young women of Constance's age. Dr. Cartwright's responses, at least those portions that survive, suggest a physician uncomfortable with the direction of Wallace's inquiries, but unwilling to refuse a client who paid promptly and generously. He provided dietary recommendations rich in fats and starches, suggested minimal physical activity to reduce caloric expenditure, and noted that while such a regimen was contrary to typical medical advice, it would indeed produce the sustained weight gain that Wallace seemed to desire. He included warnings about potential health complications, strain on the heart, difficulty with mobility, increased risk of various ailments. But these warnings were perfunctory and never developed into refusal to continue the consultation. By 1837, when Constance was 17, Wallace's letters to Dr. Cartwright had taken on a quality that the physician would later describe, in a letter to his own brother, as deeply unsettling. Wallace wrote not about his daughter's health, but about her utility, about the ways in which her physical form had developed in directions he found unexpectedly advantageous to certain domestic arrangements he was implementing. He asked questions about the psychological effects of isolation, about whether a young woman kept confined and provided with unlimited food might develop a kind of docile dependency that would make her compliant to uses that she might otherwise resist. Dr. Cartwright responded to this letter with a brief note stating that he could no longer in good conscience continue the consultation, and he returned Wallace's most recent payment. Wallace did not write to him again. The barn sessions. A system revealed. The barn behind the Hendren house measured 40 feet by 60 feet, larger than necessary for the estate's modest livestock holdings, and its interior, according to testimony given during the 1844 probate proceedings, had been divided into two sections. The front contained conventional storage and animal stalls. The rear section, accessed through a door that remained padlocked except during specific hours, contained what witnesses described with reluctance bordering on refusal. A space furnished not for agriculture but for human occupancy, with a raised platform reinforced to support extraordinary weight, ventilation grates installed near the ceiling, and walls lined with fabric that muffled sound. It was here, according to fragmentary testimony that survives only in legal abstracts, that Wallace Hendren implemented the reward system documented in his third ledger. The discovery of the barn's rear section occurred on August 23, 1843, when Robert Talmadge, a Louisville banker serving as estate administrator, entered the structure to assess its contents as part of the property inventory. What he found caused him to exit immediately, mount his horse, and ride 7 miles to the county seat without speaking to anyone else present at the estate. He returned 3 hours later with Sheriff William Bradford, County Clerk Thomas Whitfield, and Dr. Edmund Voss, the county physician. The 4 men entered the barn together and remained inside for 2 hours and 14 minutes, according to the timekeeper's notation in the estate inventory record. When they emerged, Sheriff Bradford ordered the property sealed and posted a deputy at the entrance with instructions that no one was to enter without written authorization from the probate court. The official inventory filed on August 25th describes the barn's front section in conventional terms: agricultural implements, 3 horse stalls, hay storage loft, various tools in serviceable condition. The description of the rear section is far more abbreviated. Interior space, 40 feet by 30 feet, containing furnishings and modifications of a nature requiring separate documentation. See Physician's Supplementary Report. That supplementary report, written by Dr. Voss in Latin and marked to be sealed by court order, was not transcribed into English until 1967, when a historian researching antebellum medical practices obtained permission to examine the probate archives. The Onset translation reveals details that explain why the document was sealed for 124 years. The rear section contained the platform that had been noted in the architectural survey, measuring 8 feet by 10 feet and raised 18 inches above the floor level. The platform was constructed of heavy timber, reinforced with iron brackets, and covered with fabric padding that showed signs of repeated use and periodic replacement. Around the platform's perimeter, at intervals of approximately 2 feet, iron rings were embedded in the floor, each ring attached to a short length of chain. The purpose of these restraints, Dr. Voss noted, appeared to be positioning rather than forcible confinement, suggesting cooperation, or at least submission rather than violent struggle. The ventilation system, visible through grates near the ceiling, was more elaborate than any agricultural building required, clearly designed for the comfort of human occupants during extended periods of indoor occupation. The walls were lined with canvas fabric, heavy material that served both to muffle sound and to create an atmosphere of enclosure that separated the space psychologically from the exterior world. Gas lamps provided illumination, their placement suggesting careful attention to visibility and shadow. And in a corner of the room stood a chair, upholstered, with a small table beside it that held what Dr. Voss described as personal effects suggesting regular occupancy by the deceased. The chair faced the platform at a distance of approximately 10 feet, positioned for observation rather than participation, and the wear patterns on its arms indicated years of use. Dr. Voss's report concluded with a paragraph that he wrote in Latin specifically to prevent casual readers from understanding its content. The physical evidence, combined with testimony from the enslaved men and the condition of the deceased's daughter, compels the conclusion that this space served purposes that defy both moral comprehension and legal categorization. What occurred here constitutes a violation of human dignity so profound that language itself seems inadequate to its description. The rotation schedule and its enforcement. The coded entries in Wallace Hendren's private ledger correspond to a rotation system that assigned specific men to specific dates with bureaucratic regularity. The pattern suggests careful management to prevent repetition within short intervals and to distribute access in a manner that created competition among the 7 men, each of whom understood, according to later testimony, that compliance meant reduced labor, improved food, and the temporary suspension of punishment, while resistance meant consequences that Hendren administered with the same methodical patience he applied to every aspect of his estate management. The system functioned for 4 years without disruption, maintained through a combination of incentive and isolation so complete that even neighboring plantations had no knowledge of what occurred within the Hendren property boundaries after nightfall. The rotation schedule followed patterns that revealed Wallace Hendren's capacity for systematic organization, applied to purposes that transcended conventional moral boundaries. Each man appeared in the ledger approximately once every 8 to 10 days, a frequency that Wallace apparently determined through experimentation during the early months of the system's implementation. The intervals were irregular enough to prevent predictable patterns but consistent enough to maintain anticipation, and the rewards granted after each session were calibrated to ensure that compliance remained more attractive than resistance without becoming so generous that the men might feel they had gained leverage or negotiating position. The sessions themselves occurred in the barn's rear section, according to a schedule that Wallace controlled completely. A man would be summoned from the converted carriage house where the 7 lived in conditions that were neither comfortable nor deliberately harsh, adequate shelter and food, but nothing beyond survival necessity. The summoning occurred without warning, typically in the early evening after the day's labor had concluded, and the selected man would be escorted not by Wallace himself, but by whichever of the other 6 men Wallace had designated for that purpose, a rotation within the rotation that ensured each man was implicated in the system's enforcement, that none could claim innocence or mere victimhood when all had participated, at various times, in the delivery of their fellows to the barn. Constance would already be present when the man arrived, brought from the main house by her father hours earlier, positioned on the platform in whatever manner Wallace had determined appropriate for that evening's session. The testimony describing these arrangements, given years later during probate depositions, is fragmentary and couched in language so euphemistic that its full meaning requires reading between the documented words. But the pattern is clear. The man would be offered a choice that was structured to appear voluntary, while actually allowing no meaningful refusal. He could participate in what Wallace termed the evening session, or he could return to the carriage house and face consequences that were never explicitly detailed, but that every man understood would involve not merely physical punishment, but the systematic destruction of whatever marginal comforts their lives contained. The rewards for compliance were documented precisely in Wallace's ledger. Additional food rations appeared most frequently, extra portions of meat or flour, or the occasional luxury of coffee or tobacco. Reduced labor hours followed, a Sunday afternoon without work, an early end to a week's field tasks. Private sleeping quarters were granted to men who participated with what Wallace described as full cooperation and adequate enthusiasm, a phrase whose implications are rendered even more disturbing by its bureaucratic neutrality. And for those who distinguished themselves, there were greater privileges: exemption from the overseer's supervision, permission to fish in the river on designated afternoons, access to books or other items that made enslaved existence fractionally less unbearable. The enforcement mechanisms were never explicitly documented, but emerged from testimony given during the probate proceedings. Resistance was met with immediate revocation of all privileges and assignment to labor tasks that were designed to break the body and spirit. A man who refused a session would find his food rations reduced to subsistence minimum. He would be assigned to dig drainage ditches in summer heat or clear brush in winter cold. He would be isolated from the other 6 men and subjected to surveillance so constant that sleep became difficult and peace became impossible. And Wallace would explain, in words whose reasonableness made them more chilling than threats, that the man had chosen this outcome, that comfort and relief remained available whenever he decided to reconsider his position, and that his suffering would continue as long as his stubbornness persisted. Constance's silence. Testimony that never came. In the aftermath of Wallace Hendren's death and the subsequent legal proceedings, multiple attempts were made to obtain testimony from Constance Hendren regarding the conditions of her life in her father's house. She was interviewed 3 times by different court-appointed officials, and each interview produced the same result. Constance would respond to questions about household management, dietary habits, and daily routines with mechanical precision. But when questions turned to her relationship with her father or the 7 enslaved men on the property, she would cease speaking entirely and stare at a fixed point on the wall until the interviewer abandoned the line of inquiry. A physician who examined her in November 1843 noted in his report that she exhibited symptoms consistent with profound psychological withdrawal and recommended that she not be compelled to testify, a recommendation the probate court accepted, with what appears, in retrospect, to have been relief. The first interview occurred on September 8, 1843, in a room at the county courthouse where Constance had been brought by Sheriff Bradford and Dinah Marsh, the housekeeper, who had agreed to remain with her during the legal proceedings. The interviewer was Thomas Whitfield, the county clerk, whose private letters to his brother reveal that he approached the task with profound reluctance and completed it with something approaching horror. Constance sat in a chair that had been reinforced specifically for her size, her hands folded in her lap, her expression blank in a manner that suggested not calm, but absence, as if the woman occupying the chair was not truly present, but had retreated to some interior space beyond the reach of external questions. Whitfield began with simple inquiries designed to establish basic facts. He asked about her age, her education, the management of the household. Constance answered each question in a voice so quiet that Whitfield had to lean forward to hear her responses. Yes, she was 23 years old. No, she had not received formal schooling beyond her 14th birthday. Yes, Dinah Marsh managed the kitchen and the cleaning. Yes, her father had always been attentive to her needs. The answers came slowly, each one requiring visible effort, as if speech itself demanded more energy than Constance possessed. But she answered, and Whitfield continued, gradually approaching the questions that truly mattered. When he asked about the barn, Constance stopped speaking. Her gaze, which had been directed vaguely toward Whitfield during the earlier questions, shifted to a point on the wall above his left shoulder, and remained fixed there with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something that existed only in her interior vision. Whitfield waited. He repeated the question. He rephrased it. He approached it from different angles, asking about the property's outbuildings, about agricultural operations, about whether she had ever visited the structure behind the main house. Constance remained silent. 5 minutes passed. 10. Whitfield finally moved to different topics, asking about the 7 enslaved men, about whether she knew their names, about whether she had interacted with them in any capacity. The silence continued. Whitfield concluded the interview after 90 minutes, having obtained no information about the matters that the probate court most needed to understand. The second and third interviews, conducted by different officials in October and November of 1843, followed identical patterns. Constance would answer simple, factual questions with mechanical compliance, but would retreat into absolute silence the moment the interview turned toward her father's activities, or the barn, or the nature of her relationship with the enslaved men on the property. Dr. Edmund Voss, who attended the third interview in his capacity as county physician, observed that Constance's silence was not defiant but protective, not a refusal to speak, but an inability to speak, as if the psychological mechanisms that would allow her to articulate her experience had been damaged or destroyed by the experience itself. His written recommendation to the probate court, filed on November 18, 1843, stated that compelling Constance to testify would serve no useful purpose and would likely cause significant additional psychological harm. He noted that she exhibited signs of severe dissociation, that her affect was flattened to a degree that suggested profound trauma, and that her capacity for ordinary human connection appeared to have been compromised in ways that might never fully heal. The court accepted his recommendation without debate, and Constance Hendren was never again asked to describe what had occurred during the 4 years when her father escorted her to the barn twice weekly and left her there with men who had been offered rewards they could not refuse. Wallace Hendren's death. The catalyst. On the morning of July 14, 1843, Wallace Hendren was found dead in his bed by his housekeeper, a free woman of color named Dinah Marsh, who had served the household for 11 years. The official cause of death, recorded by the county coroner, was heart failure, a diagnosis that required no autopsy and prompted no further investigation. But Dinah Marsh's testimony, given 3 months later during a creditor's dispute over the estate, contained a detail she had not mentioned to the coroner. When she entered Wallace Hendren's bedroom that morning, she found him lying on his back with his eyes open and his right hand extended toward the nightstand where he kept a loaded pistol. The weapon was still in its place. Hendren had not reached it in time, or perhaps, she suggested in her testimony, he had chosen not to reach for it at all. Dinah Marsh arrived at the main house at 6 o'clock that morning, as she had every morning for 11 years, entering through the kitchen door that was never locked, because Wallace Hendren did not fear theft from a woman whose livelihood depended entirely on his continued satisfaction with her service. She began preparing breakfast according to the routine that had remained unchanged throughout her employment. Coffee first, then biscuits, then the preparation of whatever meat and eggs Wallace had indicated he wanted the previous evening. On that particular morning, he had requested ham and 3 eggs, the same breakfast he ate 4 days out of 7, a man whose habits were so consistent that deviation would have been noteworthy. At 7 o'clock, when Wallace had not appeared in the dining room, Dinah carried a tray to his bedroom on the 2nd floor of the main house's west wing. She knocked twice, received no response, and knocked again with more force. The silence that followed was different from the silence of deep sleep, though she could not have articulated why she sensed this difference. She opened the door without waiting for permission, something she had never done before, and found Wallace Hendren lying motionless on his bed, still wearing the nightshirt he had put on the previous evening, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling with an expression that Dinah would later describe as neither peaceful nor anguished, but rather blank, as if whatever had animated Wallace Hendren had simply withdrawn from his body without struggle or resistance. She approached the bed slowly, already knowing what she would find, but needing to confirm it through touch. His skin was cool but not yet cold, suggesting death had occurred within the past few hours, sometime after midnight but before dawn. His right arm was extended toward the nightstand in a gesture that suggested intention, as if he had been reaching for something, when death interrupted the motion. The nightstand held a lamp, a water glass, a pocket watch, and beneath these items, partially concealed by a small leather journal, the pistol that Wallace kept loaded and within reach every night of his adult life. Dinah stood beside the bed for several minutes, looking at the pistol that Wallace had not reached, or had not reached for, and she found herself considering possibilities that she would never speak aloud, except in the testimony she would give 3 months later, when legal necessity compelled her to describe everything she had observed. A man who kept a loaded weapon within arm's reach did so because he feared something. A man who died reaching toward that weapon had recognized his danger but had failed to act quickly enough. Or, and this was the possibility that Dinah could not dismiss, a man might extend his hand toward a weapon and then choose, in the final seconds of consciousness, not to complete the reach, accepting death rather than fighting against it because fighting seemed more terrible than surrender. She left the room and walked to the converted carriage house where the 7 enslaved men were preparing for the day's labor. She told them that Wallace Hendren was dead and that they were to remain in their quarters until the sheriff arrived. Then she walked 7 miles to the county seat to report the death and to begin the process that would, within 6 weeks, expose everything that had occurred on the Hendren estate during the previous 4 years. The Creditors Discovery. The liquidation of the Hendren estate began in August 1843, and the creditors who arrived to inventory the property found assets that matched their expectations: land, equipment, tobacco stores, and 7 enslaved men whose combined auction value would help satisfy Hendren's debts. What they did not expect was the discovery made by Robert Talmadge, a Louisville banker, when he entered the barn to assess its contents on August 23rd. Talmadge emerged 12 minutes later, walked directly to his horse, and rode to the county seat without speaking to anyone. He returned 3 hours later with the sheriff, the county clerk, and a physician, and the 4 men spent the next 2 hours inside the barn. When they emerged, the sheriff ordered the property sealed, and for the next 2 weeks no one except authorized officials was permitted within 100 yards of the barn. What they found was never fully documented, but fragments of their discovery would surface in probate disputes that dragged on for 6 years. Robert Talmadge was 53 years old in the summer of 1843, a man who had spent 30 years evaluating property and calculating asset values with the dispassionate precision that banking required. He had inventoried dozens of estates, walked through homes where death had come suddenly, examined the physical remnants of lives interrupted by illness or accident or violence. He considered himself immune to surprise, familiar with the full range of human circumstance and the evidence such circumstances left behind. The Hendren estate appeared unremarkable when he arrived. On the morning of August 23rd, with his leather account book and his expectation that the inventory would be completed by early afternoon. The main house yielded nothing unexpected. Furniture of good quality but not exceptional value. China and silver appropriate to a planter of moderate wealth. Books, linens, personal effects that suggested a man who lived comfortably but without ostentation. Constance's rooms in the East Wing contained garments of unusual size and construction, evidence of the physical condition that everyone in Cumberland County had heard about, but few had observed directly. Talmadge noted these items in his ledger without comment or judgment, treating them as he treated everything else, Objects with monetary value or lack thereof, nothing more. He approached the barn, expecting similar simplicity. Agricultural buildings held tools, equipment, stored crops, perhaps a wagon or carriage requiring appraisal. He opened the main door and entered the front section where he found exactly what he anticipated: horse stalls, hay storage, implements in various states of repair. He noted these items methodically, moving deeper into the structure until he reached the interior door that separated the front section from the rear. The door was closed but not locked, and Talmadge opened it without hesitation. What he saw in the 12 minutes before he emerged caused a man who had spent 3 decades evaluating property with professional detachment to abandon the inventory, leave the estate without explanation, and ride at significant speed to the county seat, where he interrupted Sheriff Bradford's lunch and insisted, with language that Bradford would later describe as uncharacteristically agitated, that the sheriff accompany him back to the Hendren property immediately and bring both the county clerk and a physician. When Bradford asked what Talmadge had found, the banker responded that he could not adequately describe it and that it needed to be witnessed by multiple officials before any decisions about documentation or disclosure could be made. The 4 men, Talmadge, Bradford, Whitfield, and Dr. Voss, entered the barn together at 3 o'clock that afternoon. They remained inside for 2 hours and 14 minutes, a duration that suggests not merely observation, but detailed examination and extensive discussion about what they were observing and what it implied. When they emerged, Sheriff Bradford was pale in a manner that suggested nausea barely controlled. Thomas Whitfield carried his notebook, but had written nothing in it. Dr. Voss held his medical bag with hands that trembled slightly, despite his visible effort to maintain professional composure. And Robert Talmadge, who had initiated the discovery, looked like a man who regretted his thoroughness and wished he had left the interior door closed and the rear section unexamined. Sheriff Bradford ordered the barn sealed and posted a deputy with instructions that would remain in effect for 2 weeks. No one enters without written authorization from the probate court, and anyone attempting to approach the structure within 100 yards would be arrested and charged with interference in a legal proceeding. The 4 men rode back to the county seat in silence that Bradford would later describe as the heaviest he had ever experienced, and they went directly to Judge Nathaniel Whitfield's chambers, where they spent the next 3 hours discussing what they had found and how the law might address circumstances that appeared to exceed any legal category their experience encompassed. The physician's report in Latin. Dr. Edmund Voss, the county physician summoned to the Hendren estate on August 23, 1843, produced a medical report that exists today only in partial form, preserved in the archives of the Cumberland County Historical Society. The report is written in Latin, a choice that Voss explained in a cover letter as necessary, to prevent the corruption of public morals should these observations fall into common circulation. The surviving fragments describe physical examinations of both Constance Hendren and the 7 enslaved men, noting injuries, malnutrition patterns, and psychological states with clinical detachment. One passage, translated decades later by a historian researching antebellum medical practices, describes Constance as exhibiting corporeal degradation consistent with prolonged subjection to uses incompatible with human dignity, and notes that her emotional state suggested a severing of the self from the body so complete as to approach a kind of conscious death. Dr. Voss began his examination of Constance Hendren on August 25, 1843, in a room at the county courthouse that had been prepared with the privacy and discretion that such an examination required. Constance was attended by Dinah Marsh and by Margaret Whitfield, the county clerk's wife, both present to ensure propriety and to provide female companionship during a procedure that Dr. Voss approached with visible reluctance. His report opens with basic physical measurements recorded with medical precision: height, weight, assessment of overall health status, evaluation of mobility and physical function. These opening sections are written in English and contain nothing that would have required Latin translation or justified sealing the document for over a century. The report shifts to Latin when Dr. Voss begins describing evidence of physical trauma and the patterns of that trauma that suggest systematic, rather than incidental causation. He notes scarring consistent with prolonged pressure and friction, located in areas that would not typically sustain such injuries through ordinary activity or accidental harm. He observes signs of chronic inflammation and tissue damage that indicate repeated trauma over an extended period, injuries that had healed and been reopened and healed again in cycles that suggest weekly or bi-weekly occurrence sustained across multiple years. And he documents psychological responses during the examination that indicate dissociation so profound that Constance appeared at times not to register physical sensation, as if her consciousness had developed mechanisms to protect itself by severing the connection between body and awareness. The Latin becomes even more impenetrable when Dr. Voss describes the examination of the 7 enslaved men conducted on August 27th in the converted carriage house where they continued to reside pending the estate's final liquidation. He notes that each man exhibited signs of adequate nutrition and general physical health, observations that appear unremarkable until he describes their psychological presentation and the ways in which they responded to questions about their treatment on the Hendren estate. They spoke in fragments when they spoke at all. They avoided eye contact. They displayed what Dr. Voss termed effective flattening of a degree typically associated with severe battlefield trauma or prolonged captivity under conditions of systematic degradation. When questioned about the barn sessions, the men provided testimony that was simultaneously evasive and revealing, acknowledging participation while refusing to describe specifics, confirming that sessions occurred according to the schedule found in Wallace Hendren's ledger, while declining to articulate what the sessions entailed. Dr. Voss observed that their reluctance appeared to stem not from defiance, but from shame so profound that language itself seemed inadequate to its expression. One man, identified in the report only as Subject 4, stated that what had occurred in the barn was not something a man should have to say out loud, and when pressed for clarity, he responded that there are things that being made to do is worse than being killed for refusing, but you do them anyway because dying is permanent and maybe shame isn't. Dr. Voss concluded his report with a section written in Latin so dense with subordinate clauses and medical terminology that translation requires not merely linguistic skill, but willingness to confront the implications of what the language obscures. He states that the physical evidence, combined with the testimony and the contents of Wallace Hendren's ledgers, demonstrates beyond medical or moral doubt that the barn served as the location for systematic sexual exploitation that involved Constance Hendren and the 7 enslaved men in arrangements that Hendren orchestrated, observed, and maintained through a combination of paternal authority over his daughter and slave owner, coercion over men who possessed no legal right to refuse. The final sentence of the surviving fragments reads, in translation, that such degradation could occur within a society that professes Christian morality suggests a corruption at the foundation of our social order that no amount of piety or legal structure can adequately address. The 7 men's testimony. Fragments of Truth. During the probate proceedings that extended from 1843 to 1849, attempts were made to obtain testimony from the 7 enslaved men regarding their treatment on the Hendren estate and the nature of the barn sessions. Legal restrictions of the era limited the circumstances under which enslaved individuals could testify, and most of what survives comes from depositions taken by attorneys representing competing creditor claims. The men spoke in fragments, often contradicting each other or refusing to answer questions directly. But a pattern emerges from the scattered testimony. They describe a system in which refusal meant punishment so severe that compliance became the only rational choice, and compliance meant participation in acts that each man understood as a form of slow moral death. One man, identified in court documents only as Moses, property of the Hendren estate, stated that they were given a choice that was not a choice. We could die quick or die slow, and we chosen slow. The first deposition occurred on September 15, 1843, when attorneys for 3 different creditors sought to establish the value of the 7 enslaved men and whether their testimony might affect the estate's total asset calculation. The man identified as Simon was brought to the county courthouse and questioned in a room that contained 5 white men, 3 attorneys, the court recorder, and Sheriff Bradford, whose presence was required by law when enslaved individuals provided testimony. Simon sat in a chair near the door, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze directed at the floor, and he answered questions in a voice so quiet that the recorder had to ask him repeatedly to speak louder so his words could be accurately transcribed. The attorneys began with simple, factual questions designed to establish the conditions of labor on the Hendren estate and whether Simon had been treated according to the standards that Tennessee law theoretically required. Simon confirmed that he received adequate food. He stated that the work was demanding but not beyond his capacity. He acknowledged that Wallace Hendren had never subjected him to physical punishment of the kind that other enslaved men in the county routinely experienced. The attorneys, satisfied with these responses, began approaching the questions that truly interested them: the nature of the barn sessions and whether Simon had participated voluntarily or under coercion that might affect the legal status of his testimony. Simon stopped answering. He sat in silence while the attorneys repeated their questions in various formulations. Each attempt to extract information met with the same blank refusal to speak. Finally, one attorney asked directly whether Simon had been forced to do things that he did not want to do, and Simon looked up from the floor for the first time during the deposition and said, "Every day of my life I've been forced to do things I don't want to do. That's what it means to be property." The attorney pressed further, asking whether the barn sessions were different from ordinary forced labor, and Simon responded with a statement that the recorder transcribed, but that the attorney immediately moved to have stricken from the record. "There's field work and there's housework, and then there's what happened in that barn, and if you asking me which one was worst, I'm telling you I'd rather be back picking tobacco in August heat than have to remember what we did twice a week for 4 years. The depositions of the other 6 men followed similar patterns over the next 3 months. Each man confirmed the basic facts. The sessions occurred according to Wallace Hendren's schedule. Participation was rewarded with privileges and improved conditions. Refusal would have resulted in consequences that made compliance the only survivable choice. But when asked to describe the session specifically, to articulate what occurred between themselves and Constance Hendren, while Wallace watched from his chair, the men retreated into silence or spoke in fragments so indirect that their meaning had to be inferred rather than stated clearly. The man called Moses provided the most direct testimony during a deposition taken on November 3, 1843. When asked whether he felt responsible for what had occurred, Moses responded that responsibility required choice, and choice required freedom, and he had possessed neither. When the attorney suggested that he could have refused regardless of consequences, Moses stated, "You asking me if I should have chosen to be beaten to death or sold away or starved into the ground, rather than do what Master Hendren wanted. You asking me that from a place where you never had to make that choice and you never will. We could die quick or die slow, and we chose slow, and now you, sitting here, judging us for wanting to live." The testimony was fragmentary, often contradictory, and legally insufficient to establish clear facts about the nature of the barn sessions. But the pattern that emerges from the scattered depositions is unmistakable. 7 men were placed in a system where their survival depended on compliance with demands that violated their humanity. They complied because the alternative was death or suffering that made death seem preferable. And they lived with the knowledge that their compliance made them, in their own estimation, and in the eyes of any moral framework, participants in their own degradation and in the degradation of a woman who had no more choice than they did. The auction of Lot 17, the estate auction held on October 19, 1843, proceeded according to standard protocols until the auctioneer reached Lot 17, Constance Hendren herself. Under Tennessee law, she was considered property of the estate to be liquidated along with the land and enslaved persons, a legal technicality that resulted from her father's failure to provide for her in a will, and the creditors' claim that she represented an asset of monetary value. The auction drew a crowd estimated at over 200 people, most from neighboring counties, and the bidding, according to newspaper accounts, proceeded in near silence. The winning consortium paid $3,200, a sum that exceeded the value of the land itself, and immediately arranged for Constance to be transported to a private institution in Kentucky where she would remain until her death in 1851. The 7 enslaved men were sold separately to different buyers throughout Tennessee and Mississippi, deliberately dispersed to prevent them from ever communicating with each other again. The auction was advertised in newspapers throughout central Tennessee and northern Alabama for 3 weeks prior to October 19th, with notices that listed the Hendren estate's assets in conventional agricultural terminology: land, buildings, equipment, livestock, and human property. Lot 17 was described with clinical brevity. 1 female, white, age 23, unusual physical condition, to be sold for immediate removal from Cumberland County. The phrasing was sufficiently ambiguous to generate speculation and curiosity, and by the morning of the auction, the crowd that gathered at the county courthouse exceeded any previous estate sale in the region's history. The auctioneer, a man named Howard Breslin, who had conducted estate sales throughout Tennessee for 15 years, began the proceedings at 10 o'clock with the conventional opening: land first, then buildings and equipment, then livestock, and finally human property. The bidding for the land was competitive but unremarkable, with a Nashville banker ultimately purchasing the 2,400 acres for $8,100. The equipment and livestock sold quickly at prices that matched estimated values. Then Breslin called for Lot 17, and the crowd, which had been conversing in the low murmur typical of public auctions, fell into silence so complete that Breslin's voice carried clearly to the outermost edges of the assembly. Constance was not present at the auction. Tennessee law did not require the physical presence of human property being sold, and the probate court had determined that displaying Constance publicly would serve no purpose and might constitute unnecessary cruelty given her psychological condition. Breslin described her according to the legal documentation: age, physical measurements, current residence at a temporary facility in the county seat, and the condition that she be removed from Cumberland County within 30 days of sale. He set the opening bid at $500, a figure that reflected both her status as a white woman, which created legal complications that property status only partially resolved, and her physical condition, which limited her utility for any conventional purpose. The bidding began slowly. A consortium of 3 planters from adjacent counties offered $800. A Louisville businessman, whose interest in the proceedings would later be questioned but never fully explained, bid plus $200. The consortium countered with $2,600. The bidding continued in increments of $200, each bid accompanied by whispered consultation among the consortium members, until the amount reached $3,200, at which point the Louisville businessmen withdrew and the consortium secured Lot 17. The price was extraordinary. It exceeded the value of the land. It represented more than twice the combined value of the 7 enslaved men who would be sold in subsequent lots, and it suggested motivations that had nothing to do with economic calculation and everything to do with the consortium's determination to remove Constance Hendren from Cumberland County permanently and completely. The 7 enslaved men were sold individually over the next 2 hours. Simon went to a Mississippi cotton planter for $8.90. Moses was purchased by a tobacco farmer in western Tennessee for $8.65. The remaining 5 men sold for prices ranging from $780 to $920, and the buyers, according to later documentation, had been carefully vetted by the consortium that now controlled the estate's liquidation. Each buyer signed an agreement that prohibited the resale of his purchase within Tennessee for 10 years, and that included language requiring the permanent separation of the 7 men. They were to be dispersed across different states, prevented from communication, and effectively erased from each other's lives as thoroughly as if they had never shared 4 years of experiences that none of them would ever be able to forget. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the Hendren estate had been completely liquidated. The land, the buildings, the equipment, and the human beings who had lived and worked and suffered there had all been converted to monetary value and distributed to new owners. Constance Hendren was transported to Kentucky the following morning in a private carriage, accompanied by 2 nurses and a physician, and she would never return to Tennessee. The 7 men departed in different directions over the next week, each beginning a new life that would be shaped forever by the 4 years they had spent on the Hendren estate, and by the knowledge that they carried memories too shameful to speak and too terrible to forget. The Whitfield Letters. A Judge's Private Horror. Judge Nathaniel Whitfield presided over the probate proceedings of the Hendren estate from 1843 to 1849, and his private letters to his brother, a minister in Baltimore, reveal a man increasingly consumed by what he had learned in the course of his judicial duties. The letters, preserved in the Maryland Historical Society archives, contain passages that suggest Whitfield viewed the Hendren case as evidence of a moral rot at the heart of the slave system itself. In a letter dated December 1844, he writes, "I have learned that there are degradations which our laws not only permit but facilitate, and I am forced to conclude that any system which grants one human absolute power over another will inevitably produce monsters who exercise that power in ways that mock our pretensions to Christian civilization." Whitfield resigned from the bench in 1850, citing ill health, and never practiced law again. The correspondence between Nathaniel Whitfield and his brother Samuel began in 1820 and continued until Nathaniel's death in 1863, producing a collection of over 300 letters that document the personal thoughts of a man whose public position required careful neutrality on questions that privately tormented him. The early letters discuss legal philosophy, family matters, and the ordinary concerns of professional life. But the letters written between 1843 and 1849, during the years when Nathaniel presided over the Hendren probate case, reveal a transformation in his thinking about law, morality, and the institution that defined Southern society. The first letter that mentions the Hendren case was written on September 7, 1843, less than 2 months after Wallace Hendren's death. Nathaniel describes the initial discoveries at the estate in language that is carefully vague, acknowledging only that the probate proceedings involve circumstances of unusual moral complexity, and that he finds himself confronting questions about the relationship between legal authority and human depravity that his legal training had not prepared him to answer. By December 1844, after more than a year of proceedings that required him to review testimony and examine evidence, Nathaniel's letters have taken on a tone of barely controlled anguish. He writes that he has read depositions from men forced to participate in their own degradation and examined ledgers that document exploitation with bureaucratic precision. He asks his brother what it means to be a judge in a system that transforms human beings into instruments of another's depravity. The letters continue through subsequent years, each one revealing a man wrestling with questions that have no satisfactory answers. Nathaniel describes his growing conviction that slavery creates conditions that inevitably corrupt both those who own and those who are owned. In August 1849, when the final probate ruling was issued, Nathaniel wrote what would be his last letter about the case, describing himself as spiritually exhausted and morally compromised by participation in legal proceedings that required him to make rulings about the monetary value of human suffering. The Dispersal and Its Purpose. The creditors who assumed control of the Hendren estate made a decision that was both practical and strategic: complete dispersal of all human assets associated with the property. The 7 enslaved men were sold to buyers in different states with contractual language that prohibited resale within Tennessee for a period of 10 years. Constance was removed to an institution whose records were sealed by court order. Dinah Marsh, the housekeeper, was paid a settlement and relocated to Ohio. The barn was dismantled in November 1843, its lumber sold separately, and the land where it stood was plowed and planted with wheat. The purpose of this dispersal was never officially stated, but letters between the creditors suggest a shared understanding. The Hendren estate represented a scandal that, if fully exposed, would threaten property values throughout the county and raise questions about practices that other planters preferred to keep unexamined. The decision to disperse all human assets was made during a meeting held on September 30th, 1843, in a private room at the Cumberland County Bank. The attendees included Robert Talmadge, the Louisville banker who had discovered the barn's contents, 3 local planters who had formed the consortium that would eventually purchase Constance Hendren, and 2 attorneys representing the multiple creditors with claims against the estate. No official minutes were recorded, but letters written by Talmadge in subsequent months reveal the reasoning that guided their decision. The primary concern was containment. The discovery of Wallace Hendren's barn created a scandal that, if widely publicized, would invite scrutiny from Northern abolitionists already portraying Southern society as fundamentally corrupt. The Hendren case provided precisely the kind of evidence that anti-slavery advocates could weaponize in their propaganda. The creditors understood that allowing the case details to circulate beyond Cumberland County would damage not merely the value of the Hendren estate, but the reputation and economic stability of the entire region. The secondary concern was precedent. If the Hendren case were fully exposed and subjected to moral condemnation, it might prompt questions about practices on other estates where the power dynamics of slavery had produced arrangements that owners preferred to keep private. The solution was systematic dispersal and enforced silence. The 7 enslaved men would be sold to different buyers in different states, separated permanently, and prevented from communicating with each other. Constance would be removed to Kentucky and placed in an institution whose records would be sealed by court order. Dinah Marsh would be paid $300 and relocated with the understanding that her continued silence was a condition of payment, and the barn itself would be completely dismantled and its materials scattered. The dismantling began on November 8, 1843, and was completed within 3 days. The lumber was sold to different buyers throughout the county. The iron rings embedded in the floor were removed and melted down. The fabric lining the walls was burned. Within a week, no physical evidence remained except a rectangular patch of ground that was immediately plowed and planted with winter wheat. Constance's final years in Kentucky. The institution where Constance Hendren spent the final 8 years of her life was the Woodbridge Sanatorium, a private facility near Lexington that specialized in the discreet care of individuals whose families sought to remove them from public circulation. Records from Woodbridge, fragmentary and incomplete, indicate that Constance never recovered her capacity for ordinary speech or social interaction. She ate mechanically, slept irregularly, and spent hours staring at walls or windows without apparent focus. Dr. Harrison Polk, who treated her from 1844 until her death, noted in his case file that she seemed to exist in a state of voluntary absence, as if the mind had fled the body and left behind only the minimum functions necessary for biological survival. She died on March 3, 1851, at the age of 31, of pneumonia, and was buried in an unmarked grave in the Woodbridge Cemetery. Constance arrived at Woodbridge on October 21, 1843, 2 days after the estate auction that had transferred legal custody of her person to the consortium of Cumberland County planters who had paid $3,200 for the right to determine her fate. She was transported in a private carriage accompanied by 2 nurses and a physician, whose task was to ensure that she arrived in stable physical condition. The journey took 4 days, and the physician's travel notes describe a patient who remained silent throughout the trip, who ate when food was placed before her but showed no interest in eating, and who stared out the carriage window for hours without apparent attention to the landscape. Dr. Harrison Polk conducted his initial examination of Constance on October 23rd, and his notes reveal a physician confronting a case that exceeded his previous clinical experience. He observed that Constance responded to direct questions with brief answers containing no elaboration or emotional inflection, that she performed basic self-care tasks when instructed, but showed no initiative without prompting, and that her affect remained completely flat regardless of external stimuli. When he asked how she felt about her current situation, she responded, "I don't know what I feel." When he asked what she hoped for in the future, she stared at him for 30 seconds before saying, "I don't think about the future." The daily routine at Woodbridge was designed to provide structure for patients whose psychological conditions made ordinary life unsustainable. Constance participated with mechanical compliance. She rose when awakened. She ate the meals brought to her 3 times daily. She sat in the common room during designated hours but never initiated conversation. She walked in the gardens when escorted but showed no interest in flowers or changing seasons. She existed, but existence seemed to require all of her available energy. The pneumonia that killed Constance began in late February 1851 as a mild respiratory infection. The infection progressed rapidly, and by March 1st it was clear that Constance lacked the physical resilience to fight effectively. She died on the morning of March 3rd. Constance was buried on March 5th in an unmarked grave that remains unmarked to this day. She was 31 years old. The legacy of silence. In the decades following the Hendren estate scandal, references to the case virtually disappeared from public record. Newspaper archives show no follow-up stories after the initial auction coverage. Court documents related to the probate proceedings were sealed in 1851 and remained closed to researchers until 1967. Local histories of Cumberland County, published throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, make no mention of Wallace Hendren or his daughter. The silence was not accidental, but deliberate, maintained through a combination of legal restriction, social pressure, and the shared understanding among Tennessee's planter class that certain stories once told could undermine the foundations of the social order they depended upon. The Hendren case became what historians call a negative space in the historical record, visible only through absence and the occasional fragmentary reference that survived despite attempts at erasure. The process of erasure began before Wallace Hendren's body was cold. The consortium of creditors and planters who assumed control of the estate's liquidation understood immediately that complete disclosure would create a scandal extending far beyond one man's depravity. They moved quickly to seal court documents, to disperse the human assets who might provide testimony, and to dismantle the physical structure that contained evidence of what had occurred. That cooperation was secured through mechanisms both formal and informal. Newspaper editors in Cumberland County and surrounding regions received visits from prominent planters who suggested that continued coverage would not be in anyone's interest. Attorneys who had participated in the probate proceedings found themselves socially isolated if they spoke too freely. Ministers discovered that their churches received more generous donations when they focused on biblical stories rather than local scandals. The legal sealing of the probate documents in 1851 represented the final formal act of erasure. Judge Nathaniel Whitfield, in one of his last rulings before resigning, ordered that all testimony and evidence be sealed for 100 years, citing concerns about public morality. The documents were placed in a locked vault in the county courthouse basement, where they remained until 1967, when a researcher accidentally discovered their existence. Local histories published between 1870 and 1950 mention dozens of plantation owners who operated in Cumberland County during the antebellum period. Wallace Hendren's name appears in none of these histories. His 2,400-acre estate is never mentioned. It is as if Wallace Hendren and everything associated with him had been surgically removed from the historical record. The 7 enslaved men who spent 4 years on the Hendren estate were dispersed to different states, and their subsequent lives remain largely undocumented. None of them left written testimony. None of them told their stories to journalists or historians. The silence that surrounds the Hendren case extends even into contemporary historical scholarship. The 1967 opening of the sealed documents generated limited academic interest. The Hendren case exists in historical scholarship as a footnote, never examined in depth and never allowed to speak fully. The question that remains. More than 180 years after the events at the Hendren estate, the questions that matter most remain unanswerable through documentary evidence alone. We can reconstruct the mechanics of what Wallace Hendren created: the isolation, the reward system, the bureaucratic precision with which he managed his daughter's degradation, and the coerced participation of 7 enslaved men. We can trace the legal aftermath and the institutional response. What we cannot recover is the interior experience of those who lived through it. What did Constance Hendren understand about her father's intentions? At what point did understanding become unbearable? And the 7 men, caught between impossible choices, each forced to become complicit in a horror they had no power to stop. What remained of their humanity when it was finally over? These questions exist in the space where history ends and moral imagination must begin, and they remain as disturbing today as they were in that Cumberland County courtroom in 1844, when Judge Whitfield closed his journal and wrote the last line he would ever record about the case. Some truths are too terrible to fully document, yet too important to completely forget. The limitations of historical documentation become most apparent when we attempt to understand the subjective experience of those who cannot speak for themselves. We have Wallace Hendren's ledgers, which tell us when sessions occurred and what rewards were distributed. But ledgers cannot convey what Constance felt when she heard her father's footsteps every Wednesday and Friday evening. We have fragmentary testimony from the 7 enslaved men, but testimony given under legal coercion cannot capture the full complexity of being forced to choose between survival and moral integrity. What did Constance understand, and when did she understand it? Her withdrawal from public life at age 14 coincides with the beginning of her physical transformation, suggesting that Wallace's intentions were established early. Did she comprehend the full implications when her body began changing? At what point did experience become so unbearable that her mind responded by severing its connection to sensation and emotion? The questions surrounding the 7 enslaved men are equally unanswerable. They were offered what Wallace Hendren framed as a choice. But was this actually a choice? Can we speak meaningfully about choice when the person offering it possesses absolute power over your existence? The men participated and accepted rewards, becoming complicit in a system that degraded both themselves and Constance. But complicity implies agency, and these men possessed no alternatives that did not end in their own destruction. Judge Nathaniel Whitfield understood this when he wrote his final journal entry. He recognized that the Hendren estate represented not an aberration, but a logical extension of the system's fundamental premise: that absolute power over another human being creates conditions where the darkest possibilities will inevitably manifest. The silence that followed was a collective refusal to acknowledge what the case revealed about the institution that defined Southern society.